Hey, shall we get started? Okay. I think this one was, at least for me, harder than usual because it's a lot of information. It's not very easy to grasp. Um, so maybe you can start with Jenna, since I know you've been exploring the guild and probably have better context setting thoughts than the rest of us. So kick us off.
I can try. Am I audible? Looks like my green dot's good. Yeah, it's
Yep.
so much to absorb. I wouldn't swear to anything. But I also thought I found and dropped the link to their current 6-week cycle, if in case, I don't know if you want to pull that up, because where have they been and where are they going? So I continue to wonder about and Venkata, you mentioned, I think on Friday, that Gnosis might itself have kind of first mover advantage now. Yeah, you probably put it differently, but that the multi-sig safe that they came out with is could end up being the kind of the one everybody uses because it's trusted and safe and such. So some of the things on my mind are the core team there is small, of course, and like any small team, that's a certain vulnerability. What are they doing for their own succession planning? Seems important to be thinking about right at the start, and I'm sure they are, but I don't have any insight into that. I know that the Zodiac Wiki conversations, that's just getting started off, but they've had a really interesting conversation going on about begin with exit strategies in mind. So how do you take your cookies and leave when you're ready, or planning for how the thing would sunset. Has been an interesting thread over there. There was one more piece. Oh, I know. The other thing that's on my mind for them is I see a lot, in my various readings. I can't point to anything in particular. Is the all software is subject to bugs. So the bigger they get, the more they will also be targets. And so the security-minded, like Nathan, you're here today. Maybe you could speak to that. What are they? Is there any possible way that they are invulnerable? Because if they're not invulnerable, that means they're vulnerable. And I have no expertise to explain that. I think the other thing, I back to the size question. I saw a nice tweet go by over the weekend. I think about um, 35, 15 to 35 to 50, somewhere in that range. Some proportion of kind of core contributors, and then a larger penumbra of sort of somewhat active participants. I know the conversation for us has been going on about how to define active yaks versus inactive yaks versus yaks that are gone. So for all the DAOs, these are all sort of I think these modules that the Zodiac, that the Gnosis, what are they actually calling it again? The Gnosis expansion pack. Zodiac is the expansion pack. Um, Addresses this kind of hairball of interrelated issues in a way that is both complicated, but once you can, I think once if we start using it, once you get each module tucked into what it does and your mind about what it does, um, like any complicated game, it suddenly will feel like second nature. So, should we go backwards today? Shall I pass to Ben, maybe? Sorry, Ben, I've been thinking
Yeah,
about
sure.
giving people
Yeah.
more time.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy. So, I read this, and I sort of work in the space, but not directly on Ethereum. So I'm aware of most of what it's trying to do here. I'm aware of Moloch DAO and what they tried to do with that. Um, I don't know. The downside of that is that now I have a lot of preconceived notions about all this kind of stuff. Like, I've heard of the reality.f oracle. I took a little look at it, and it seems okay. The oracles are hard to make. Um, Same with the bridge. I tried to look for more details on that because good bridges are very hard to make, but lazy bad bridges are very easy to make. As you can follow the space, you might have noticed in the past, I don't know, month or so, there's been a lot of problems with them. So I don't know about what exactly this bridge does or how it works, and it's got to be dependent on the precise details of the two chains you're trying to bridge across. So I don't know. What I'm saying is I'm not sure how I would actually trust these different modules, though I can see why they're trying to do what they're trying to do. And I mean, for most things, they're probably okay. The exit or rage quit function from Moloch DAO, I think, is a good idea. My biggest critique of that is that it requires people to pay attention, because you have basically a proposal happens, you have a time for which you can exit with your full amount, and if you skip it, you have to deal with the proposal. And the proposal can be an arbitrary execution. So I mean, someone can put up a proposal, I get all the money, and then what's supposed to happen is everyone is supposed to see this and be like, oh, this guy's or whatever, we're just going to all exit, and then they don't get any money. But that requires you pay attention, and that's expensive and hard to do. I think that's good if you have a group of like 10 people who are all really committed to it. It's a lot less good in a group of 100 people or 1,000 people, where people might check on it every week or so, depending on how long big a window you have to exit. Gnosis Safe, I don't know. I know the history of the space, so I thought it was funny when you said that you think Gnosis Safe is going to be standard. And I was like, parody must be very sad. I'm rambling now. Beyond that, I'm not sure if I have any like particular ideas of what you're trying to do, and if this is the right tool for the job. So here, I'll kick it on so I don't just ramble for 20 minutes. Who wants to be next? Person above me?
It's me. I quickly went through all tried the article, and it seems like a description of the various tools. So unless you start using it, I won't have much opinion about it. Though the bridge seemed interesting, way to connect different DAOs. But yeah, I don't have much to say unless I start using it. Maybe next is Venkatesh.
All right. Yeah. Unlike Anuraj, I tend to have lots of opinions on tools even before I try them. Yeah, I mean, this seems like an attempt to realize what everybody talks about, which is composability. And I think the idea for composability is a little bit, I don't know, a utopian tendency that's coming from probably two places. I think one is everybody in this space has kind of like a reaction against the Web 2 model of like intense competition, lots of platforms trying to own a space like social networks. And then the intense competition leads to one giant thing that is like Facebook size and like runs everything for everybody in that part of like infrastructure operations. So that's one thing I think everybody in this space has a kind of negative reaction to. But the other thing they have a negative reaction to is they don't want what happened to, I guess, the open source alternative side of Web 2, which is like all these well-intentioned people, they think, all right, Facebook sucks, so I need an alternative to Facebook, so I'm going to make this cute little indie version of Facebook, and maybe people will use it with their friends, and there won't be advertising, and everything will be great. And the way that kind of thing fails is it has like no conceivable line of sight to scaling to all the things Facebook does. So I think the interest in composability is kind of an attempt to do an end run around competition dynamics and hope that everybody gets along in a nice cooperative way. That's one element. And the second is not actually give up the ambitious scaling that Web 2 and older platforms achieve. And the idea, I guess, is if you define this kind of like extremely interoperable platform and a set of standards right out of the gate, like not many of these tools are like fully developed or even exist yet. So this is like a standards committee that has kicked in before all the technical problems have been figured out, which to me, I don't know, it strikes me as dangerous. Like if you go back to the history of innovation, standard stuff usually happens like after a couple of deep cycles of building and people actually encountering real problems. Like, for example, industrial safety standards in the 19th century, it was like after decades of like steam engines and boiler explosions, at some point they realized that they needed better standards for, boilers and stuff. And that's when the committees got together and opened standards for, metals, um, water quality, pressure, all those things came in, and boilers became much safer. And this is an attempt to do that before we kind of know all the problems. We kind of know a little bit, like Ben was talking about, like, bridges don't seem to work very efficiently. There's various problems with various bits and pieces, but we don't, we maybe don't know enough to come up with the set of standards that can allow the technology stack to scale in a peaceful, non-competitive way and get to like all the functionality and scale of something like Facebook. So it's just, by the way, is a little bit surprising to me because I actually haven't done any exploring at all on the Zodiac system until late last night. And I actually kind of like thought it might be an interesting lower stakes alternative to Colony. So we've been experimenting with Colony, and the thing that I think has gotten us stuck with Colony and finding it hard to use is it's kind of like an all-in-one system, and it seems to have like a minimum critical mass of activity before you can use it well. Like there's a lot of complicated moving parts to Colony, and if you don't have enough activity to need all that, Colony becomes like an overpowered tool, and it's hard to use, including problems like people not showing up enough and so forth. So I thought Zodiac, since the thesis seems to be you can start as small as you like with maybe just a Gnosis Safe, and then maybe add little bits and pieces and grow along with your needs of capabilities, then it might be better. But I'm not sure that it actually does that. Like in theory, it's supposed to, but this is like a lot of stuff to learn right out the gate to, I don't know, lay out kind of like complexification roadmap is the way I would put it. It's like kind of have to anticipate and like plan for all this complexity. But that said, yeah, I think there's something here, but it might be a little too idealistic right now. Like I saw the phrase conviviality somewhere mentioned there. So tools of conviviality, Ivan Illich, that immediately signals to me that there's a lot of idealistic hope embedded in the scheme. But there do seem to be bits and pieces that look promising, like the, I forget the name of it, commitment voting. I went ahead and read that article, which was linked off the main one. So commitment voting does seem to be a way to get past the problem we've already encountered, which is, people kind of like just show up for a brief window and do something, and that's open to a lot of exploits. And unless you kind of hang around and sort of stay plugged in and participating, it's hard to like avoid various failure modes, both malicious and sort of not malicious, but happening out of neglect. Like, proposal goes up, it's supposed to like close in 3 days, and by 3 days, 90% of the people have lost interest. So if it's some sort of optimistic consensus, it goes through anyway. If it's not, it fails. Neither seems ideal. And this commitment voting model seems to be kind of interesting because you declare a bunch of positions and it sort of persists, and then you can sort of retune the commitments and kind of integrates over time. So yeah, there's a bunch of interesting ideas, but I don't know, this isn't, as encouraging as I thought it would be. But okay, I'll have to think more about it. But passing on to Juan.
Yeah. Just had a look through the article, and I'd actually seen it quite a while ago. I'm actually already had it open in my tabs. And I'd opened it because it was recently, I think 4 days ago, they submitted it as an EIP to try and turn it into an actual standard. Not the extensions, but just the original kind of like 4 components. So the idea of having an avatar contract, and then having just a bunch of different sections underneath it, so modules, extensions, and so on. So, which I thought was quite interesting, and reminded me of DAO-style, who I think are a subgroup or related group of MetaGov, and they had like the DAO-style standard, which I think was EIP or something 4824. I can share the link afterwards. again, quite interesting because I think Tish, you're right that maybe it feels a little bit premature if you think about the other standards and when they arrived. I think the ERC20 arrived in 2015, and then was kind of like ratified by ICOs in 2017, like a couple of years later. But so it was quite slow and really just solved some need that people had at the time. The ERC71 came in 2018, but that kind of came alongside CryptoKitties, so the team launched it and the standard at the time. And I think this idea of where standards fit in each part of crypto or blockchain or Web3 or whatever you want to call it is quite interesting. I don't really have an opinion on this one. I think DAOs are obviously a lot more messy. I think when the team at MetaGov and DAO-style, which I think includes pretty much every DAO, loads of the big DAOs, and also Dr. Michael Zargham from Block Science, his point was that as they were going through this like model of what would be standardized within a DAO, they pretty much ran into three things. One was there's a member list and I guess some conditions that make someone a member or not a member. There's an activity list, and then there's like I think it's just like a name, so name, activity, and members. And beyond that, everything else was like custom and different per DAO. So even this, I think, is going to be useful for some DAOs and kind of completely useless for others. But the extension idea seems to be gaining a lot of traction in crypto in general, or definitely in DAOs. So I think it might work. Though I think lots of people in crypto have problems with Gnosis Safe anyway. It's quite hard to use. Lastly, I thought it was worth considering an article by Jesse Walden, who I'm sure people know. He's previously at Media Chain, then at Andreessen, and now he runs Variant. And he wrote this a while ago, actually in 2019. It's called Incomplete Contracts. And there's a nice idea there that Bitcoin is, some people say it's a complete system, as in everything defined and it can scale kind of forever because it has it can scale socially infinitely because everybody has a defined role within that system. So they come in, their miners or their nodes or their users, they just want to put transactions through and everything's defined. And he kind of maps it back to legal theory and saying like some very few contracts, only the simplest contracts are complete. So you could say that Uniswap is a complete contract, but something like a DAO is not, because there's a significant amount of it that's defined and kind of captured or kind of resolved by governance and governance token, which is a bit messier and not defined in the contract. So I thought it was interesting thinking about what they have chosen to put in the standard and what they haven't. So an avatar is something that maybe is common, it could be seen as being complete, also incorporating the idea of modules and extensions to capture the more incomplete nature of DAOs. Yeah, that was where I got to. Someone to Scott's listening, Rafa listening, Nathan.
Sorry. So I have slightly disorganized because I'm trying to take notes for everyone right now. But I think, both Ben and Venkat brought up questions around scaling in different ways. I think this is something I kind of keep having in the back of my mind. I'm still sort of really skeptical that any of this scales to, much past, whatever the Dunbar number of people. I think one of the things I observed in this space is, unless you're like, once you get outside of the people who are really into like, we're going to build DeFi for everyone, all the other proposals seem much more small world to me. And I feel like this seems to be like, I do have a hard time, as Ben mentioned, seeing this, like, does this scale to 1,000 people? I'm not sure. I'd be really, really doubtful, but I'm not sure how much of any of what's going on in the DAO space realistically scales to that many people. So I do wonder, I don't know if that's a bug or a feature here. I think there does seem to be, like, when you look at the discussions around social media right now, I think there's a lot of feeling that these large agglomerations of people maybe don't work as well as we would like. And I wonder if whether or not the people who are designing this are consciously thinking about that, how much of that zeitgeist is bleeding into these proposals. And there's sort of like a, I don't know, subconscious, if you will, desire to almost be anti-scaling here for some of this. You could imagine instead of having, I don't know, DAOs of small groups and then networks of DAOs, maybe DAOs of DAOs, and it starts being very like certain branches of anarchist philosophy eventually. In terms of like the security aspect, like I am not, I don't think I could really speak to a lot of it. I'm still getting my head around, Web3 and blockchains. I don't think I've tried to read a couple of Solidity contracts, and my reaction is always Solidity just seems like a really bizarre language. So I'm not the person to really ask there. It feels like reading Haskell almost. But I do think there are some things around time delays that have definitely come out recently. I mean, even just the beanstalk thing that happened over the weekend, having some sort of time delay would have helped with that, but it wouldn't have necessarily prevented it. It feels like what's missing in a lot of this is, and maybe I just didn't get very far in the article, so maybe that it's spoken to later on, is there does seem to me that there's a need, at least at this stage, for most of these proposals to have some sort of like break glass functionality to them, some sort of emergency lever that can be pulled to stop a process during like the delay period. And it's not clear to me that any of this really speaks to that, but until we have a much better sense of how to build, I'm not even going to say how much better sense, until people start building much better tools, and I don't know if these are those much better tools, in the blockchain space, like there's just too much room for exploiting, particularly these sort of timing race-like conditions in the space. And we really need something that can halt the execution of these things when they go off the rails. So I think that's like feels like the thing that's kind of missing to me, and maybe it is in there and I just didn't see it. Because I didn't get as far through that. So those are my initial thoughts. Handing up to Mayor.
Thank you. I don't know, this sounds, everybody's very negative about the blockchain. I'd like to look at it in a more positive way. I'm trying to figure out if what Gnosis are doing is more glue or more components. And in any case, it looks like a very interesting set of tools that they want to provide. And I think it's somewhere between the equivalent for coding of GitHub and an editor. So what it's not doing is providing us with debugging tools or with management tools. But as we know from coding, slowly these features make their way into the very basic tools, like Visual Studio. So if somebody were to ask me, well, what's missing here in the Zodiac package, I would say management tools, especially tools for debugging and understanding what's going on, and even more so for the individual DAO user to understand what's happening in the DAO. And here I want to riff off what Ben said. People don't give attention means they should have an automated tool which provides them with attention and provides them alert when they need to pay attention so that they can do whatever they do in the normal life. Having said all of that, the document itself was a bit weird to me. There's some hint here, but I don't know what it means. The use of gaming language. Okay, strength, magic, dexterity, intelligence, wisdom. I don't understand why that's relevant for DAOs. And when I say relevant, why these are the primitives that are suitable, not even best suitable, but suitable for describing what a tool gives a DAO. And also the part about Zodiac at the beginning kind of lost me. So those are my impressions of this document, but just I'll say again, the particular tools are important tools, and if they work, they're definitely part of the solution. So having a safe, having the reality with the reality S oracle, having a bridge, having exitability, having other ways of managing things. These are all very good and very important components. Definitely part of the solution. So that's what I have to say.
All right, looks like we've done one run around, and I do have a secondary prompt here, which is I thought this Zodiac ecosystem might be kind of like a good second experiment after Colony. Like we've got some experience with Colony, it's on the back burner now, we haven't touched it for a while. So Colony and Clarity, I'm thinking of them together, but Clarity might be composable here. And this is slightly confusing to me because it's partly a standard and partly an existing set of tools. And somewhere in there, they mention a list of like, oh, we have partners, and it includes things like Colony. So it's not entirely clear to me how this is supposed to work, but the prompt, long-winded way to get there, but the prompt is, if you were to do an experiment with the Zodiac ecosystem, what would be the simplest experiment to kick the tires on this concept? So that's the prompt, but also floor is open for any additional thoughts and questions or comments.
I'd be curious to have this group today spend at least a little time thinking about the transition that's planned, which is this would become a conversation for what we are doing, which to me is a little different from continuing to explore the space itself. And Venkat, I'm wondering if there's some version of it that I just dropped a link to those groups. I'm going to drop a screenshot. If we continued this idea of on some slow cadence, inviting some of these other groups in to talk, because it sounded like Ben maybe, and Vaughn maybe, and certainly Rafa would know groups that are actually deep in it using the Zodiac tools, for example. And would it be fun to get them in to actually talk about, so how's it going? And as always, trying to find the wheat, not the chaff, and who's actually in the weeds doing this work with groups.
Just one comment is that even though like Zodiac is actually quite new, a lot of the people are still kind of like exploring what to do. For example, Radical, who's listed in here, and I think so. Moving Castles, Other Internet, and such. They're more like exploratory conversations that they haven't like integrated. I would say it's still pretty early, and I haven't necessarily seen someone like deploy a full kind of like solution just yet. At least I'm not aware of it. That's saying like, oh, we're using like the Zodiac module. I see a lot of people experimenting with it, but not necessarily like committing to it like fully. Just FYI. It's just complicated. All this is like.
Thanks, Rafa. That makes perfect sense. It's just still super early. We're all just
Yeah.
Experimenting maybe.
But one of the things that I know that Radical is experimenting with, which I think is quite a good use. So number one, we can get a demo of Zodiac module if we would like. I've actually been meaning to schedule one for the Mirror DAO. So if we want to if we want, I can ask for a demo conversation on that, and then you guys can attend and just listen in. We can record it and such. But I know Radical, for example, is experimenting with what they call guard modules. So being able to allocate funding to essentially sub treasuries, but then having a master revoking switch, so that if any of those pods or sub DAOs essentially goes rogue, that the central DAO can trustlessly via proposals remove the power of the people who are participating in that treasury management process. I know that they're exploring that, but again, they're still very early days for them. It's mostly theoretical. I'm also planning on having a workshop with them. I don't know if I could potentially invite you guys to listen in on some of their conversations as well. With Radical, I mean, I'm planning on having a design workshop with them probably next week.
Happy to see join if that ends up being okay. Take it, Nathan.
Oh, I was just going to say I would be interested in sitting in, assuming I can make those. So keep me looped in. Radical is something that I found that actually I think is the thing I've been almost most interested in the space so far. I find them kind of fascinating. So I would love to have an opportunity to learn more. In terms of just a thought really quick in terms of the modules, I think the guard functionality seems almost the most useful for the ecosystem in general, having better permissioning between things. But it's unclear how we would do anything with it. So I feel like if we were going to try to do something with this, it would be trying to, we've done a lot of discussion about how to deal with voting potentially and proposals. And it would be, looking at this and being can we do something with this that starts to build out, a system that, some sort of voting proposal system and integrate with that. So that would be my thought. What I feel might be the path of least resistance for us, mostly because we've done the most discussion about it, and because it's not clear to me what other tools from this we would necessarily use. Though that is still, it's not actually a simple thing necessarily to test.
I think something about what Nathan is saying makes me think that even though we are framing and trying to approach this as kind of a social and cultural problem, we have a set of tools and there's an adoption conversation and learning and tool learning and things like that. I think at some level, this is not fundamentally a social or cultural challenge at all. This feels like, pre-Turing machine computer science, between when Hollerith and Babbage were building mechanical contraptions that looked like textile looms, up until the 1930s, when Turing and Church and others kind of formalized the foundations of computer science. And so you can sort of see the shift in computer architecture before the 1930s and after. Before the 1930s, they looked like clever mechanical devices with some weird general properties. And after the 1930s, they suddenly looked like this completely different class of thing that should not be confused with industrial age mechanical machinery at all. And part of that was thinking in terms of the abstract model of infinite tape and how do you do computation in a universal sense. Something like that is happening here. the basic problems like gating in time and permissions and keeping voting preferences persistent through time. It sounds to me like this whole thing is like a kind of a distributed social computing problem that needs to be formally defined, that nobody has done so yet. And what we have right now is this sort of undefined future formal problem space and one sort of existence proof of one type of system that works within it, namely kind of like existing voting-based democratic organizations that we kind of have some experience with, but almost in like a folklorish way. And this is, by the way, might be one reason why lore has become so important. It's like we have a couple of 100 years experience with democracy and voting and how those things work and various ways they can screw up. And that's a set of lore we are drawing on. Here we've kind of invented a set of tooling that potentially seems to expand the design space like way more. Like if there were like 3 or 4 patterns of democracy that could be done pre-blockchain, now there's like 300 patterns of like democratic governance that's possible. And we don't yet have like a formal notion of how the space is structured, what its fundamental, like, conservation laws and impossibility theorems are. And it almost feels like that needs to happen before we can build well-posed tools. And there's almost like a chicken and egg problem. Until you have that, you won't have the tools. And until you have the tools, you won't be able to explore the problem space and do the formalization. So something like that seems like where we are, where the social and cultural problems seem almost like symptoms of not understanding the underlying formal problem.
What I'm feeling is that we have a misalignment of incentives. On the one hand, you're saying we're in the middle of the 19th century and we need to get quickly to the late 20th century. And traditionally, we do that by iterations. We build something, it fails, we build something better, we find out what works, and so on. But in the blockchain world, everything we do is public. That's not a problem. All our money is public, and the minute somebody finds a bug, they can steal our money. That's a problem. Okay? So it's not even like a web browser where if they find a security leak, 5 minutes later, they can plug it. You know, in blockchain, if they now find a security problem with a smart contract for Bored Apes, we're going to read about it in the newspaper tomorrow, how somebody stole another 10 Bored Apes, paid $5 each. So there's a misalignment of incentives beyond the fact, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, I think, that blockchain is not as flexible as other things. So I don't know if you have any ideas how to deal with that, but especially the development of law implies, and I asked and you disagree, but there's no management of law in DAOs. Definitely not when you have 1,000 people, because they're distributed. And if law is an important part for solving problems and dealing with things, and it's flexible, it really means that blockchain can't work by itself. It needs a component which provides a flexibility, which blockchain is trying to prevent. It's perhaps, let's call it American management style on steroids. So you're supposed to do what your boss tells you. But actually, there's a lot of back-channel discussions. Well, in blockchain world, there isn't. Not supposed to be. So yeah, what Raf was writing, exactly. I don't know how you combine the two, but you have to have an opening for it. Otherwise, we'll be stuck with blockchain preventing us from iterating and making small mistakes rather than big ones.
can just respond to that. I think I do agree that I think the individual DAO organization is incredibly exposed to, as you said, like attack and so on. But I think because the code on which it runs and the assets are all public, as an overall ecosystem, I think it's incredibly resistant actually, because you can have lots of people who lots of individuals fail and they update their law incrementally, and then there are bugs found. But typically, when something's solved or something's found, it's shared across the entire space. Plus, most teams are literally building on top of code written by other people. So most people are building on top of, say, Gnosis Safes, or they're building on top of ERC20 or ERC71, and they're getting a significant amount of the innovation of the entire space for free at once. So I think for me, it feels like it's maybe worse on the individual front, but better on a collective front.
I just wanted to make a quick observation two quick observations before I have to hop off. The first was, I think that Vaughn is right about the fragility of individual DAOs versus the ecosystem as a whole. That said, I think that individual fragility makes it very hard to bring people into space. I think it's one of the sources of some of the polarization, and there needs to be more of a thought of the debugging tools, taking things maybe a little bit slower. Like the one thing that this whole space seems to have let go is the move very, very fast philosophy, but a lot of moving fast doesn't mesh well with making things secure, because it's hard and requires a lot of introspection there. And I think there's a real tension there, and the one thing that should have been given up maybe wasn't in this space in terms of development. My second thought was just to go back to what Venkat was talking about. I think, Venkat, you called this social computing, which I think is that's a really interesting frame, and I kind of really like the frame. It does make it less clear where the formalization might come from. Like in the history of computing, formalization came out of mathematics, but I'm not sure that a formalization of social computing can come out of mathematics in the same way that computer science came out of mathematics. It does seem like this might be we've been moving to more general case questions around we've been moving to more general cases of the question of what the interaction between humans and machines look like. How that influences both of them. And I wonder if this social computing problem is less of a computing problem and more of an interface problem. We're in the process of creating a set of generalized man-machine interfaces. And what does it look like to have a generalized human-machine interface like that? And it kind of makes me really want to go back and reread Ghost in the Shell, because I feel like that was a lot of the things that Shiro was playing with in there, a lot of the questions of what does that general interface look like. And so I wonder if it maybe is this a social computing question, or is this an interface question where we've now gone from levers to keyboards to now we're actually thinking about how to build essentially a society or a social group with machines. What does that even mean? And what do the interfaces in that social group look like? And that might be kind of the core question here.
All
and
right.
I need to drop now, so thanks everyone.
Yeah, and yeah, I guess we can stop the call here. So next week, I believe actually Nathan is leading a session. No, actually it's Patrick, I think. But yeah, keep thinking about this. And if anybody can think of an actual experiment to try with the Zodiac system, bring it up for discussion in the blockchain channel, and we can talk about it. All right. Thanks, everybody.